In 2019, I found myself subletting a small cabin after a pretty heated fallout with my dad. It was meant to be a temporary escape, something to help me clear my head. The landlord, who I'll just call that for simplicity's sake, had his own stuff going on. So he rented the place out month to month. It was a good fit for me since I wasn't planning on staying long. The cabin was tucked away at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a few other small, similar-looking cabins. One of them seemed vacant. No cars, no lights. And the others, well, I never really saw anyone. I kept to myself. The place was quirky, with 2 cramped floors. The bedroom was upstairs, but you had to climb a short flight of stairs and open this odd hatch door to get up there. The kitchen was tiny, but it worked for me. I'd been there for about a month when things started getting strange. I work long 12-hour shifts, so by the time I get home, I'm usually dead tired. That night was no different. I made myself a quick dinner, peanut butter sandwich and a protein shake. Nothing fancy. And headed upstairs to bed. Like always, I shut the hatch door behind me. There was something unsettling about that door. It didn't lock, and it never really felt secure, but the idea of leaving it open while I slept gave me the creeps. I needed that barrier, even if it was just a flimsy one. I turned on the TV, hoping it would help me unwind. But just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A voice from down below, soft, almost like a whisper, but clear as day. "Who's up there?" My body froze. My heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded like it came from inside the house. I quickly turned off the TV, plunging the room into darkness, save for the soft glow from the moon peeking through the small circular window above the bed. I crept over, peering out into the night, but all I saw was emptiness. No movement, no shadows, nothing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it came from outside. It had to. Still, I called out, "Who's there?" Silence. The stillness in the cabin felt heavier now, like the air itself was holding its breath. My skin prickled with unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced at the hatch door, and my stomach twisted. What if someone was inside? Maybe it was my dad, I thought. Maybe he came over unannounced. Grasping at straws, I opened the hatch and cautiously peered down the stairs. "Dad?" I called out. No response. I swallowed the lump in my throat and stepped out of the bedroom, descending the stairs one careful step at a time. Each creak of the floorboards echoed through the house, making me wince. I flipped on the living room light, and the space illuminated instantly. Everything looked normal. No signs of anyone. I flicked on the outside lights and scanned the front yard through the window. Still, nothing. Confused, I stood there for a minute, my heart still pounding in my chest. It must have been something outside. I was just tired hearing things. I shook off the tension and went back upstairs, closing the hatch behind me with a little more force than necessary. I climbed back into bed, grabbing the remote to turn the TV back on, hoping the noise would push away the unsettling thoughts. But just minutes later, I heard it. Asterisk bang, bang, bang. A violent pounding on the hatch door. The sound was so loud, so angry, it felt like the entire cabin shook with each hit. My blood ran cold. Someone was asterisk, downstairs, asterisk. I froze, my body locking up in fear. The door had no lock, and whoever was down there could easily push it open. I stared at the hatch, my mind racing. What could I do? My legs felt like lead, my breathing shallow and fast. My phone. I needed my phone. But when I reached over to the nightstand, it wasn't there. I felt a surge of panic. I must have left it downstairs. Of course, tonight, of all nights. I sat there for what felt like forever, paralyzed by the thought of moving. The pounding had stopped, but I knew someone was still there, waiting, watching. I had no choice. I had to get out. Summoning every bit of courage I had, I slowly, quietly opened the hatch door. The staircase below was pitch black, but I couldn't risk turning on any lights. I held my breath and tiptoed down the steps, making sure not to make a sound. My heart thudded in my ears so loudly, I was sure whoever was in the house could hear it. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, I made a split-second decision. Instead of searching for my phone, I bolted for the back door. Barefoot, I pushed through the door and sprinted across the dirt road, the cold ground biting at my feet. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest house with its lights on. Panting, I knocked furiously on the door, hoping someone would answer. I banged on my neighbor's door, desperate for help. My fist pounded against the wood, the sound echoing into the night. After what felt like an eternity, a man appeared in the window next to the door. Relief surged through me, but that relief quickly turned to dread. He just stood there, staring at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, like he didn't fully register what I was saying. I pressed my face to the glass, explaining in a frantic voice that someone was inside my cabin and I needed to call the police. But he didn't move. He didn't respond. He just stared. His face was blank, expressionless, and it made my stomach twist with unease. Was he involved? Did he know what was going on? Panic bubbled up inside me, and I took a step back from the door, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. This man, the silence, the eerie stare, it all felt connected somehow. I turned and hurried away from his house, realizing I had no other choice. I had to go back to the cabin. I slipped inside as quietly as I could, locking the door behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest as I frantically searched for my phone. I tore through the living room, the kitchen, the tiny hallway, before the thought hit me. I must have left it in my car. Of course. I dashed outside and found it sitting in the center console. Grabbing it with shaky hands, I rushed back into the cabin, locking every door, flipping on every light, trying to chase away the suffocating darkness. Upstairs, the TV was still on, filling the silence with the low drone of voices. I crept back up the stairs, dread pooling in my stomach as I reached for the hatch. The door creaked open, and there, sitting on my bed, was a man. He was facing the TV, his back to me, staring blankly at the screen like he belonged there. Like he had been there all along, I screamed. Slowly, the man turned his head towards me. His movements were deliberate, almost inhuman. I didn't wait to see his face. I bolted, running down the stairs so fast I nearly tripped. I slammed through the back door and ran straight to my car, locking myself inside. My fingers fumbled as I dialed 911, my eyes glued to the cabin. From the car, I watched as a figure, the same figure, emerged from the back of the cabin and casually walked into the woods. He didn't run. He didn't even look at me. He just disappeared into the darkness, like he was part of it. The police arrived not long after, but when they searched the cabin, they found nothing. No man, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest anyone had been there but me. The officer asked if I had somewhere else to stay for the night, and without hesitation, I packed a few important things and headed back to my dad's house. The next day, I returned to gather the rest of my stuff. I couldn't stand to be there any longer. The landlord met me, surprisingly eager to refund part of my rent. But when I told him what had happened, his reaction, or lack of one, made my skin crawl. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even seem surprised. It was like he knew. Between the neighbors' disturbing silence, the landlord's urgent need to rent out the cabin, and the man in my house, I can't shake the feeling that it's all connected. That something bigger was happening behind the scenes. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe it was just a string of coincidences. But late at night, I still wonder. Was the man I saw in my bed real, or is he still out there, lurking in those woods, waiting for someone else to stumble into that cabin? It was a Tuesday night, around 11:30 p.m., and I was walking down a dimly lit street, heading home from work. My car had been in the shop for a week, so I had no choice but to walk the 3 miles back every night. Honestly, it wasn't the worst. Southern Indiana, where I lived, was quiet after dark, especially after 10 p.m. The roads emptied out, leaving the town in a strange, peaceful silence, only broken now and then by a passing truck on its way to Indianapolis. That night, though, something felt different. The air seemed thicker, heavier, like the stillness was watching me. After about a mile, I turned onto the familiar dirt road that cut through a dense patch of forest. I'd taken this route countless times before, but the dark trees pressing in on both sides always gave me the creeps. With only 2 miles to go, I quickened my pace, hoping to get home soon. As I walked deeper into the woods, the only sounds were my footsteps crunching against the gravel and the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A distant hum. At first, it was so faint, I almost thought I imagined it. But as I kept walking, the sound grew louder, unmistakable now. It was the hum of a motor, getting closer. Something about it made my skin prickle. As I walked, the low hum of the van's motor crawled up my spine. I turned my head just enough to see it, an old beat-up van creeping down the main road I had just left. Its lights were off, which wasn't too strange for this town. People drove junkers all the time, with busted headlights and other issues, but something about the way it moved, slow and deliberate, put me on edge. Suddenly, the van's engine roared to life and its headlights blazed on, cutting through the darkness. It sped up, barreling down the road in my direction. My heart pounded, and I quickened my pace. Just keep walking, I told myself. It's probably nothing. Then, just as quickly, the van's lights flicked off again. It slowed down, now about 500 feet from the turn, onto my dirt road. My unease morphed into a cold wave of fear that swept over me. This wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I kept my head down, trying not to show how rattled I was, but my legs moved faster, almost of their own accord. I stole a glance over my shoulder and my heart nearly stopped. The van had turned onto the dirt road. It was following me. That's when the doors of the van swung open. Panic took over. I broke into a full sprint, my feet slapping against the gravel. The sound of my own breathing mixed with the crunch of dirt underfoot as I raced toward the cover of the forest. My only thought was to get off the road, get somewhere they couldn't find me. Then came the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. It echoed through the trees, and I ducked instinctively, adrenaline flooding my system. I veered into the woods, dodging between trees until I spotted a large rock. I dove behind it, my body trembling, trying to calm my ragged breaths. I crouched there, heart thudding in my ears, when I heard voices. A man's voice, rough and close. I think she went into the woods? My blood turned to ice. Before I could process it, I heard something even more chilling. It wasn't just him. 3 young girls, their voices soft, eerie, and disturbingly calm, answered him in unison. "Okay, sir, we'll find her." I pressed my hands over my mouth, desperately trying to keep quiet. Who were these people? What did they want? The fear that gripped me was beyond anything I had ever felt. Then the man's voice cut through the night again, sending a wave of nausea through me. "Whoever finds her doesn't have to drink the blood tonight." I felt a scream rise in my throat, but I forced it down. These weren't just people. This was something far worse. I had to stay hidden, had to stay quiet. My life depended on it. I was paralyzed with terror, crouched behind the rock, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Who were these people? Was this some kind of cult? Those girls, they couldn't have been innocent. Their voices were too calm, too obedient. Time dragged on as I strained to hear every footstep, every rustle in the woods. Then, through the branches, a flash of red and blue lights. My heart soared. Cops. Somehow, they'd found me. Without thinking, I bolted from my hiding spot, stumbling through the underbrush, waving my arms and screaming for help. The relief was overwhelming as the officers rushed toward me. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But when one of them spoke, my blood ran cold again. "Ma'am, do you know about the body?" I froze, confused, but when I turned toward the headlights, I saw it. Lying in the gravel, bathed in the harsh glow of the police lights, was the body of a young woman, naked, mutilated. Her insides spilled out onto the dirt, blood soaking the ground around her. I gagged, barely holding back the urge to vomit. Shaking, I explained everything to the cops, the van, the man, the girls, and the twisted ritual I overheard. They looked as disturbed as I felt. They promised they would investigate. and one of them offered to drive me home. I accepted, too shaken to protest. Back at my house, sleep didn't come. I kept glancing out my window. The horrific image of that girl's body burned into my mind. But just as I started to think the nightmare might be over, I saw it. The van. The same van from earlier, creeping slowly down my street, with its lights off again. This time, I was prepared. I grabbed a pen and quickly jotted down the license plate before calling the police. They showed up not long after, but the van was already gone, disappearing into the night like it had never been there at all. The next day, an officer called me back. "We ran the license plate," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "It's registered in South Dakota, but we've had reports of that same van all over the country tonight. One in Vermont, one in Nevada, one in Alaska, and one in Texas. All of them with the same plate." I was speechless, my skin crawling at the impossibility of it all. The officer promised to keep me updated, but I never heard back. I left Indiana not long after, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching me. To this day, I have no answers. I don't know what that van was, who those people were, or how it could have been in so many places at once, but I've learned one thing. I trust my instincts now. The moment something feels off, I don't hesitate. I run, because sometimes running is the only thing that saves you. My wife, Carol, and I live a simple, ordinary life in a quiet suburb. We've got regular jobs, friendly but distant neighbors, and our days follow the same rhythm. Nothing ever happens around here. It's the kind of place where the most exciting event is a yard sale or a neighborhood barbecue. For the longest time, that was perfectly fine with us until recently. Something happened one night that we can't explain, and the thought of it still gives me chills. It started like any other evening. Carol and I decided to shake up our routine by going out for dinner. We got home around 9 p.m., and by 10 o'clock we were already settled in bed, winding down with our usual show. It was just a regular night, until the phone rang. Carol glanced at me, half annoyed, and told me not to answer. "Nobody calls this late with good news," she said. And she was right, of course, but for some reason, I had this nagging feeling. What if it was important? I reached over for the landline, but the ringing stopped before I could pick it up. We shrugged it off, figuring it was a wrong number. But then, just a few minutes later, it rang again. This time, I looked at the caller ID. Unknown number. Now, that was odd. No one calls after 10 o'clock unless it's an emergency, right? I hesitated for a moment, but I still didn't pick it up. The phone rang a third time, and by then it felt like I had no choice. I lifted the receiver. "Hello?" I said. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it sounded off, strangely distant. It was Al, our next-door neighbor. Without any greeting, he asked, "Do you know about the man standing in front of your house?" I froze, the question hanging in the air. "What?" But before I could ask anything else, Al hung up. My stomach turned as I told Carol what he said. Her eyes widened with fear, and she grabbed my arm. "Don't go outside," she whispered, almost pleading. I wasn't planning on it, but I had to at least take a look. I crept downstairs, pulled the curtain aside, and peeked through the window. The front yard was empty. No one was there. Hash, hash, hash. Middle annoyed and puzzled, I stepped outside to see for myself. The street was as empty as ever. There was no one hiding in the bushes, no shadows moving between the houses. I stood there, feeling the cool night air against my skin, and started to wonder if maybe Al was messing with us. He'd never pulled anything like this before, but I couldn't shake the strange tone of his voice. I decided to call him back, but when I did, it went straight to voicemail. I was about to head back inside when the phone rang again. Another unknown number. My stomach clenched. This time, it was Al, but his voice sounded even stranger. It was slow, almost deliberate, as if he was carefully choosing his words. Go outside. There's someone standing outside your house. I barely had time to process the words before he hung up. My heart was racing now, a sense of unease gripping me. Something was wrong. I hurried downstairs and peeked through the curtains, dreading what I might see. There, standing at the edge of our walkway, was a man. He was facing the house, his head lowered just enough that the hood he wore hid his face completely. His posture was unnaturally still, like he was waiting for something, or someone. A cold wave of fear washed over me as I stared at the figure. He wasn't moving. He wasn't leaving. He was just asterisk, asterisk, there, asterisk, asterisk. My gut told me to stay inside, but my anger got the better of me. I opened the door, just enough to lean out, and called, "Can I help you?" My voice cracked a little, betraying my fear. The man didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge me. "Hey!" I called louder, my nerves getting the best of me. "I'm calling the police. If you don't leave." My voice was stronger now, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Still, he stood there, completely still, as if he hadn't heard a word I said. Before I could do anything else, the phone rang again. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding, and ran inside to grab the phone. This time, the caller ID showed Al's actual number. I picked up, expecting another eerie message, but it wasn't. "Hey, man." Al's voice was normal, almost casual. "I just got your voicemail. What's going on?" I froze. "What do you mean? You called me twice, telling me someone's outside." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What? No, I didn't. I haven't called you all night." My blood ran cold as his words sank in. "Al," I said slowly, "someone called from your number. And they sounded just like you." He sounded genuinely confused and a little unnerved. "I don't know what to tell you, but I'm not outside your house. I haven't seen anyone all night." I went back to the window, a knot tightening in my chest. The man, the one who had been standing so still, staring at our house, was gone. Just like that. No sign of him. No trace. My mind was spinning. "Al, I swear you called me twice. There was a guy standing right out front, and..." Al cut me off. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but it wasn't me. I swear." I hung up, still trying to make sense of it all. I looked through the window one last time, but the street was empty again. I was convinced Al was messing with us, but his confusion seemed genuine. We argued for a bit, both of us equally baffled, until Carol suggested I put him on speaker. She needed to hear for herself that I wasn't imagining things, that the calls we'd received hadn't been some weird figment of my imagination. So, I did. I put Al on speaker, and we rehashed the whole thing again. Carol confirmed it. She'd heard the calls too. Al, now sounding just as freaked out as I was, called his wife over. She got on the phone and swore they'd been watching TV the entire evening. Neither of them had touched the phone, and they certainly hadn't been playing any pranks. Eventually, we ended the call, but the dread that had settled over me wouldn't lift. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just some late-night prank or misunderstanding. There was something else going on here. Something that neither Al nor I could explain. I went downstairs one last time, the eerie silence of the house pressing in around me. I reached for the phone to hang it up and felt a strange urge to glance outside again. Maybe I was hoping for closure, some sign that what I'd seen earlier wasn't real. I looked out the window, half expecting to see the hooded figure standing there at the end of the walkway. But the street was empty. The night had swallowed the figure whole, leaving nothing behind but the cold memory of his presence. To this day, I still don't know who, or what, called us that night. We never saw the hooded man again. And there's been no explanation, no rational way to make sense of what happened. But the feeling of dread hasn't left me. Every time the phone rings, late at night, I feel that cold knot in my stomach tighten. I can't help but think of that eerie, calm voice in the man who stood so silently at the edge of our home, staring in at us, waiting, And I wonder, was he ever really gone?